Few battles in medieval history capture the imagination like the Battle of Agincourt. On a muddy French field on October 25, 1415, a young English king, Henry V, stood with a starving, exhausted, and vastly outnumbered army against the flower of French chivalry. What followed was not merely a victory, but a turning point in the 100 Years' War, where the English longbow humbled armored knights, and courage reshaped destiny. This is the story of how outnumbered peasants and archers, led by a determined king, crushed an army that should have swept them aside. The Battle of Agincourt did not erupt from nowhere. It was the climax of a campaign born from dynastic ambition, national rivalry, and deep-rooted claims to kingship. By 1415, the 100 Years' War had already raged for decades, defined by shifting fortunes, truces, and resurgent conflict. Its roots stretched back to 1337, when Edward III of England pressed his claim to the French crown. This dynastic struggle had turned into a protracted war of raids, sieges, and occasional pitched battles, such as Crécy, 1346, and Poitiers, 1356, where English longbowmen had already proven their worth. But the late 14th century saw England weakened by internal strife and financial strains, while France itself was paralyzed by civil war between the Armagnacs and Burgundians. Into this fractured landscape stepped Henry V, crowned King of England in 1413. Henry was no ordinary monarch. Determined, devout, and militarily skilled, he sought both legitimacy at home and glory abroad. He revived the old English claim to the French crown, demanding recognition of his sovereignty and lands. When France refused, Henry launched his campaign. In August 1415, he set sail with some 12,000 men, a mix of knights, men-at-arms, and most critically, thousands of longbowmen, the weapon that would define his victory. Henry's army landed in Normandy and immediately besieged the port of Harfleur. The siege was brutal and costly. Dysentery ravaged the English, killing hundreds and weakening thousands more. By the time Harfleur surrendered in late September, Henry's army was already reduced. Despite his losses, Henry decided on a bold gamble: march his army across hostile France to the English stronghold of Calais. This march was perilous. The French shadowed his movements, gathering forces to intercept him. The English, weakened by disease and short of supplies, trudged through rivers and mud, their situation growing desperate. By mid-October, the French had assembled a massive force, perhaps 20,000 to 30,000 strong, against Henry's weary 6,000. The trap was closing, and so, on the morning of October 25, 1415, the two armies met near a small village in northern France, Agincourt. The road to Agincourt had bled England white. After weeks of exhausting marches, dysentery, hunger, and the long shadow of defeat, Henry V's army found itself face to face with a French host that dwarfed them in size and splendor. The stage was set for a clash that would either immortalize Henry or crush his crown. The ground at Agincourt was deceptively ordinary, a narrow strip of farmland bordered by dense woods on both sides. The night before the battle, rain had soaked the earth, leaving the fields muddy and treacherous. This seemingly small detail would prove catastrophic for the heavily armored French knights and men-at-arms. The battlefield's narrowness also prevented the French from fully deploying their massive numerical advantage. Instead of encircling Henry's smaller force, they were forced into a tight, funnel-like corridor, a killing ground perfectly suited for English longbowmen. Henry V commanded perhaps 6,000 men, though estimates vary. The vast majority, some 5,000, were longbowmen, drawn from English yeomen hardened by years of training. Their weapon, the English longbow, could unleash a storm of arrows at ranges up to 250 yards, piercing even the finest armor of the day. The rest of Henry's force consisted of men-at-arms, knights and infantry who would hold the line against French assaults. They were exhausted, malnourished, and weakened by disease, yet hardened by survival. Henry himself was more than a figurehead. Clad in full plate armor, wielding sword and shield, he fought in the ranks with his men, embodying the king as warrior, the man who would share both danger and glory. His leadership was perhaps his greatest weapon, Opposite him stood a French force between 20,000 and 30,000 men, nearly 5 times Henry's strength. The French host was the pride of medieval chivalry, armored knights, noble lords, and men-at-arms drawn from across the kingdom. Their banners fluttered, their armor gleamed, and their confidence was absolute. Yet this strength concealed fatal weaknesses. The French command structure was divided among competing nobles, each eager for honor. Their confidence bordered on arrogance. Many French knights believed the English were already defeated, and some squabbled over who would ransom Henry himself after his capture. Among their numbers were also large contingents of crossbowmen and infantry, though the knights were determined to lead the attack. This overconfidence would prove disastrous. On the night of October 24, 1415, the two armies faced each other across the muddy fields. The French camp was lively, filled with songs, boasts, and the anticipation of an easy victory. Some nobles even played dice to determine who would claim which English prisoners. In the English camp, the mood was starkly different. Henry ordered his men to prepare for a desperate fight. Supplies were scarce, spirits low, and exhaustion weighed heavily on all. Yet Henry walked among his soldiers, offering encouragement, reminding them of their duty and the justice of their cause. According to chroniclers, it was here that Henry delivered words that would echo through history, immortalized later in Shakespeare's Henry V, a speech that promised those who fought at Agincourt would be remembered forever. The English longbowmen sharpened their stakes, driving them into the ground to form a defensive barrier. Mud sucked at their boots, and the cold gnawed at their bones. Still, they stood ready. Morning broke on October 25th, 1415, the feast of Saint Crispin and Saint Crispinian, patron saints of cobblers and craftsmen. For Henry, the symbolism was profound, a day honoring humble men, fought by an army of archers and common soldiers against the might of French nobility. As the sun rose over the fields of Agincourt, both armies prepared. The French knights mounted their steeds, their armor clanking in the chill air. The English archers drew their bows, silent and grim. The fate of kingdoms would now be decided not by numbers, but by courage, terrain, and the deadly rain of arrows. The sun had barely lifted above the horizon when the stillness broke. Across the muddy field, the banners of France fluttered proudly, displaying the lilies of the Valois dynasty and the emblems of powerful noble houses. The French knights, their armor polished to a mirror shine, waited impatiently, their destriers stamping and snorting in the chill morning air. On the English side, there was silence. The men knew that to advance rashly would be suicide. King Henry ordered his army to hold position behind a line of sharpened stakes planted into the ground, deadly obstacles designed to cripple a cavalry charge. The longbowmen stood in ranks, bows already strung, arrow tips glinting with lethal promise. The battlefield was unusually narrow. Hemmed in by dense woodland on either side, the French knights were forced into a bottleneck, unable to deploy their superior numbers effectively. The ground between the two armies was a quagmire, churned by recent rains into sticky, sucking mud. Every step forward would be an ordeal. Though vastly outnumbered, Henry V knew he could not afford to wait forever. Supplies were nearly exhausted, and his men weakened by weeks of marching. If the French chose to starve him out, the English position would collapse. With calculated boldness, Henry ordered his army to advance a short distance and plant their stakes closer to the French lines. This maneuver shocked the enemy. A smaller, weaker force was deliberately challenging them. The French knights, stung by the audacity, resolved to crush the English quickly. The French vanguard began to move forward. As the first lines of armored knights trudged through the mud, the sky suddenly darkened with the hiss of thousands of arrows. The English longbowmen loosed volley after volley, the sound of bowstrings snapping like 1,000 drumbeats. Arrows rained down with terrible force, piercing armor, striking horses, and sowing chaos in the advancing ranks. Horses screamed and toppled, knights were thrown into the mud, and the tight formation began to break apart. Unlike the French crossbow, which required time to reload, the English longbow could unleash a relentless storm, as many as 10 to 12 arrows per minute per archer. With nearly 5,000 bowmen, the English produced a storm of iron that turned the field into a slaughterhouse. Infuriated and desperate to silence the archers, the French knights ordered a cavalry charge against the English flanks. The horses thundered forward, but the ground betrayed them. Hooves sank deep into the mire. Momentum faltered, and when they reached the sharpened stakes, the charge collapsed in bloody ruin. Arrows struck men and beasts alike. Horses impaled themselves upon the stakes, throwing their riders into the mud where archers swarmed forward with daggers and mallets to finish the wounded. What should have been a decisive strike dissolved into chaos and death. Meanwhile, the French men-at-arms on foot pressed forward. Clad in heavy plate armor, they trudged across the quagmire, weighed down by their own splendor. Each step sank them deeper into the mud, slowing their advance to a crawl. Still, sheer numbers allowed them to press closer. Wave after wave of French knights advanced under a hail of arrows, their armor bristling with shafts like the spines of a hedgehog. Many fell, but more pushed forward, determined to crush the smaller English line by sheer force. The battlefield had become a nightmare of mud, blood, and steel. The French knights were packed so tightly in the narrow field that fallen men were trampled by their comrades, suffocating in the muck beneath the weight of armor. The longbowmen's reign of death never ceased, thinning their ranks before they could even reach the English line. At last, the first French waves reached the English men-at-arms. A brutal melee erupted. Swords clashed, axes fell, and men grappled in the mud, armor scraping against armor. Henry himself fought among them, swinging his sword with lethal precision, rallying his men with both voice and steel. The English line bent, but did not break. Behind them, the longbowmen continued to loose arrows into the press, striking at the rear ranks, ensuring the French could not bring their full numbers to bear. The battle had truly begun, a test of endurance, courage, and the unforgiving might of terrain and strategy. The field of Agincourt had become a cauldron of death. What had begun as a glittering display of French chivalry, banners high, armor gleaming, was now a nightmarish crush of steel and mud. The narrow ground that had promised glory turned instead into a trap, where sheer numbers became a curse. Wave after wave of French men-at-arms pressed forward, each rank shoving the one ahead, desperate to close with the English. But the battlefield betrayed them. Horses stumbled and collapsed, their riders trampled in the panic. Knights weighed down with plate armor fell into the mud and could not rise. Many suffocated, crushed under their comrades who surged forward blindly. The English line groaned under the pressure. Men-at-arms locked shields and braced themselves against the tide of French steel. Sword met sword, mace met helmet, and bodies heaved together in a maelstrom of noise and fury. Henry's army was exhausted, outnumbered and hemmed in, yet they stood fast. As the French closed the distance, the longbowmen shifted tactics. Many abandoned their bows, picking up axes, hammers, and knives. Charging forward from the flanks, they descended upon the bogged-down French, stabbing at visor slits, prying at joints in armor, or dragging knights to the ground to be finished in the muck. The archers were poorly armored compared to the knights, but in the tight crush, mobility was an advantage. They darted among the fallen like wolves among stags, cutting down the helpless and ensuring the French advance never regained momentum. At the heart of the melee, King Henry V himself fought with grim determination. His crown, welded onto his helmet, glinted dully through the mud-streaked chaos. At one point, a French knight, the Duke of Alençon, struck directly at the king, denting his crown with a mighty blow. But Henry rallied his bodyguards, cutting down his attacker and holding the line. The sight of their king, bloodied but unbroken, fighting shoulder to shoulder with them, ignited the English troops. The cry of "St. George! St. George!" rose above the din, echoing across the battlefield. The French commanders had underestimated the mud, the bottleneck, and the unrelenting arrows. Their glorious cavalry charges had failed, their men-at-arms were suffocating under their own numbers, and the English line, instead of breaking, was growing stronger with each wave repelled. Soon the French vanguard was so tightly packed that they could not even swing their swords. Exhausted and immobilized, they became easy prey for English blades. The slaughter grew merciless. Behind them, the second and third waves of French knights struggled forward, but the field was now a graveyard of men and horses. Each new rank stumbled over the fallen, sinking deeper into the mire, breaking formation before they could even reach the enemy. By midday, Agincourt had become a vision of hell. Thousands of armored corpses littered the mud. The cries of the dying mingled with the whistling of arrows and the clash of steel. Blood ran in rivulets through the mire, mixing with the rain and filth until the field itself seemed to bleed. Yet still, the French nobility pushed forward, driven by pride, honor, and desperation. And still the English stood fast, grimly cutting down all who came before them. The decisive moment of the battle was approaching. The French army, though vast, was unraveling, its proud knights crushed by terrain, exhaustion, and the ferocity of Henry's smaller but disciplined force. By mid-afternoon, the French army, proud knights, glittering banners, and all the strength of France's nobility, had turned into a mass of chaos. The vanguard lay broken in heaps, their horses strewn across the muddy field like fallen towers. The second division, meant to sweep aside the weary English, found itself stumbling over corpses, sinking knee-deep in mud, and colliding with its own comrades. The cries of Montjoie Saint-Denis had grown faint, drowned out by the brutal chant of the English soldiers. St. George, the French advance had stalled, and with it, their hope of victory. The battlefield itself seemed to conspire against the French. The narrowing funnel of land compressed their ranks until they were packed so tightly they could hardly breathe, let alone fight. Horses collapsed in exhaustion, pinning men beneath their weight. Knights who fell could not rise again, smothered by the crush of bodies around them. Henry's army, though exhausted, had a grim advantage. They held the higher ground, their flanks protected by woods, their longbowmen unrelenting. The mud, the very rain that had seemed a curse, was now their greatest ally. In the thick of the slaughter, a sudden alarm rippled through the English ranks. Reports reached Henry that a French cavalry detachment was attacking the English baggage train behind their lines. Fear spread that the French prisoners, nobles captured alive for ransom, might seize weapons and join the attack. Faced with the possibility of betrayal from within and disaster from behind, Henry made one of the most ruthless decisions in medieval warfare. He ordered the immediate execution of the prisoners. It was a chilling command. Hundreds of knights, some of the wealthiest and most prestigious in France, were cut down in cold blood. Their pleas for ransom went unanswered. Though some English captains resisted, the slaughter was carried out swiftly. It was not chivalry that ruled Agincourt, but survival. The third French division, the last hope of turning the tide, advanced hesitantly. By now they had witnessed the carnage ahead, their comrades piled in heaps, their finest nobles dead or captured, their banners torn and muddied. The mud clutched at their boots, the arrows rained down, and their morale faltered. When they finally reached the English lines, they found no broken army, but a force emboldened by survival. English archers, many wielding swords, axes, and maces, charged into the bogged-down knights. The French assault collapsed almost as soon as it began. The battlefield was no longer a contest of armies, but a massacre. The proud French host, numbering in the tens of thousands, had been shattered by a force barely a third their size. As the last resistance crumbled, the English soldiers, muddy and bloodied, raised their weapons in triumph. The battered banners of St. George fluttered in the damp autumn air. Against all odds, King Henry V had achieved one of the most stunning victories in medieval history. For the French, Agincourt was a catastrophe. Thousands of their nobility lay dead or captured. Among the fallen were some of the greatest lords of France, the Constable Charles d'Albret, the Dukes of Alençon, Bar and Brabant, and countless others. The cream of French chivalry had been wiped out in a single day. For Henry, the victory was more than military. It was divine vindication. Against overwhelming odds, with an army weary and starving, he had triumphed through discipline, strategy, and the unyielding power of the longbow. The muddy fields of Agincourt had seen not just a battle, but the breaking of an illusion, the invincibility of the knight. From this day forward, the age of armored cavalry would fade, and the rise of infantry and archers would dominate Europe's wars. When the sun dipped low on October 25, 1415, the fields near Agincourt were unrecognizable. What had once been farmland and muddy pastures was now a wasteland of corpses, trampled earth, and broken weapons. The stench of blood and death mingled with the damp autumn air. English soldiers moved cautiously among the fallen, searching for surviving enemies and stripping armor and weapons from the dead. The wealth of the French nobility lay scattered across the ground. Gold-encrusted hilts, fine plate armor, and heraldic surcoats now caked in mud. For the common archers and men-at-arms, this was a grim harvest, yet one that meant survival. Estimates vary, but it is believed that between 6,000 to 10,000 French soldiers and nobles perished that day, compared to only a few hundred English losses. The contrast was staggering, a slaughter that shook the foundations of French pride and power. The list of the dead was a roll call of French nobility. Among them were Charles d'Albret, Constable of France, slain leading the vanguard; John I, Duke of Alençon, who nearly struck Henry himself before being killed; Edward, Duke of Bar, and Philip, Duke of Brabant, both fallen in the melee. Even more devastating, many other nobles were captured rather than killed, including the Duke of Orleans and the Count of Eu, who would spend years in English captivity. These men were not just leaders in battle, but pillars of French politics, and their loss crippled the kingdom's ability to resist. For King Henry V, Agincourt was not merely a victory, it was a transformation. He had marched into France with a sickly, exhausted army, pursued by ridicule and doubt. He left Agincourt as a figure of almost mythical stature, celebrated as a warrior king chosen by God. His speech before battle, later immortalized in Shakespeare's Henry V as the Band of Brothers address, became a symbol of English unity and defiance. Whether those words were ever spoken is uncertain, but the legend of Henry as a charismatic leader was cemented. For France, the defeat was more than military, it was psychological. The chivalric ideal that had sustained French nobility for centuries had been shattered. The knight, armored and mounted, had once been thought invincible. Yet here, on a muddy field, they had been undone by common men with bows and rough melee weapons. French politics descended into turmoil. The kingdom was already fractured by civil war between the Armagnacs and Burgundians, and Agincourt deepened the divisions. With so many nobles dead or captured, rival factions scrambled for influence, weakening France's ability to resist further English campaigns. Agincourt did not end the 100 Years' War. Far from it. The conflict would rage on for decades, but it shifted the balance of power dramatically. England gained new prestige and leverage. Henry's claim to the French throne, once mocked, was suddenly terrifyingly plausible. France suffered a catastrophic blow to its leadership and morale, leaving it vulnerable. Indeed, less than a decade later, the Treaty of Troyes, 1420, would recognize Henry as heir to the French throne, a direct consequence of his growing reputation and the devastation wrought at Agincourt. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of Agincourt was the triumph of the longbow. Once dismissed as a weapon of peasants, it had humbled the greatest knights of Europe. At Crécy and Poitiers earlier in the 100 Years' War, English archers had already proven their worth, but at Agincourt, their role was undeniable. The muddy ground, the funneling terrain, and the discipline of the English archers had combined to create a weapon of mass destruction that forever changed medieval warfare. Knights in plate armor, for centuries the masters of battle, were no longer invincible. The age of the mounted aristocrat was waning. The age of infantry and firearms loomed on the horizon. In England, Agincourt became a cornerstone of national pride. The date of the battle, St. Crispin's Day, was immortalized as a symbol of courage against impossible odds. Shakespeare's later retelling ensured that Henry's victory would live forever in English memory, not merely as history, but as legend. In France, the battle was remembered with bitterness, a symbol of arrogance, disunity, and tragedy. For centuries, it stood as a reminder of the cost of noble pride and political division. The Battle of Agincourt was more than a clash of armies. It was a turning point in the evolution of warfare, a political earthquake in Europe, and a story of human resilience and leadership under desperate circumstances. For Henry, it was the pinnacle of glory. For France, it was a day of humiliation. For history, it was a battle that defined an era. The muddy fields of Agincourt, scarred by hoofprints and blood, remain etched in the collective memory of Europe, a testament to the thin line between triumph and disaster, and the power of determination against overwhelming odds. The legacy of Agincourt can be summed up in a series of enduring lessons. Unity matters more than numbers. A disciplined force with strong leadership can overcome overwhelming odds. Technology changes war. The longbow shifted the balance of power, just as firearms would later. Hubris is fatal. The French overconfidence led them into disaster. Leadership is decisive. Henry V's ability to inspire his men transformed desperation into victory. Though centuries have passed, Agincourt remains one of the most studied battles in history. It sits alongside Thermopylae, Hastings, Waterloo, and Stalingrad as a defining moment when the fate of nations hung in the balance. For England, it was a golden memory of glory. For France, a wound that ultimately made it stronger. For the world, a reminder that the tides of history are not always determined by the largest armies, but by the choices of leaders, the courage of soldiers, and the unforgiving hand of fate. The fields of Agincourt, once muddy killing grounds, are now quiet farmland. Yet the story lingers, of arrows darkening the sky, of knights drowning in mud, of a king whose destiny was written not in numbers but in resolve. The legacy of Agincourt is not just about war, but about resilience, leadership, and the enduring power of the human spirit against overwhelming odds.